His sunflowers burst with vibrant energy, his starry nights swirl with breathtaking emotion. Vincent van Gogh, a name synonymous with artistic genius. But what if the very intensity that fueled his masterpieces was also tearing his mind apart? What if the profound beauty he saw in the world was born from a constant, agonizing struggle for sanity, compounded by crushing loneliness and an almost complete lack of recognition? Imagine an artist pouring his very soul onto canvas, creating works that would one day stun the world, yet living in poverty, ridiculed, and utterly misunderstood. This is the untold story of Vincent van Gogh's inner torment, the psychological landscape of a solitary genius, and the tragic irony of his unrecognized brilliance. Welcome to Behind the Legend, where we explore the untold stories behind the icons of history. In this episode, we delve into the life of Vincent van Gogh, not just as the renowned painter whose works are some of the most celebrated in the world, but as the deeply troubled man who struggled with mental illness, loneliness, and a lack of recognition during his lifetime. Van Gogh's life was marked by intense personal turmoil, yet his art reflects a profound connection to the world, a depth of emotion, and a struggle for meaning that transcends his pain. In this psychological exploration, we'll journey through his early failures, his relentless pursuit of artistic expression, and the inner battles he fought as his mental health deteriorated. We'll examine the profound isolation he felt as a misunderstood genius, and the deep psychological wounds inflicted by his inability to find connection or validation. Van Gogh's struggle was not just one of external hardship, but an internal war that he waged within the confines of his own mind. Through his tragic life and posthumous fame, Van Gogh's story offers us deep insights into the complexities of mental illness, the price of artistic genius, and the universal human longing for connection and understanding. Join us as we explore the man behind the masterpieces, Vincent van Gogh, the struggle for sanity and the fight for recognition that marked his journey. Vincent van Gogh's early life was marked by failure, rejection, and a sense of profound alienation. Born in 1853 in the Netherlands, Van Gogh struggled to find his place in the world, a theme that would persist throughout his life. His family, particularly his father, who was a pastor, had high expectations for him. From an early age, Vincent was aware of the pressure to succeed and to fulfill the roles that were laid out for him, yet, time and again, he failed to meet those expectations. Initially, Van Gogh sought fulfillment in a career as an art dealer, following in the footsteps of his uncle, who worked at the prestigious Goupil and Sea Gallery. Despite his early enthusiasm, Van Gogh quickly found himself unhappy in this line of work. He struggled to reconcile his passionate desire for meaning with the realities of a business career that demanded cold, detached professionalism. His emotional nature clashed with the demands of his job, and he was ultimately dismissed from the gallery. This rejection was a blow to his self-esteem, a theme that would resonate throughout his life. Following this failure, Van Gogh embarked on a series of other short-lived career attempts. He tried teaching, working as a preacher, and even sought solace in religious life, briefly attending seminary to become a pastor. During this time, he became deeply religious, attempting to find purpose in his faith. However, his intense emotional nature and inability to follow conventional paths again led to feelings of inadequacy. This period of religious zeal ended in another failure, and he was dismissed from his role as a preacher in a coal mining town in Belgium. Van Gogh's struggle to find a stable career and a sense of belonging was deeply psychological. He grappled with a powerful sense of inadequacy that defined his early years. His desperate search for meaning in work, religion, and relationships was driven by an overwhelming internal need to prove his worth, to demonstrate that he had something to offer the world. Yet, despite these failures, Van Gogh's desire to find purpose never wavered. The rejections he faced and the constant feelings of unworthiness would shape his emotional and mental state, leading him to seek solace and meaning in a final, transformative pursuit: art. Art, which had always been a passive interest, now became Van Gogh's ultimate lifeline. At the age of 27, with few professional prospects and a growing sense of isolation, Van Gogh turned to painting in earnest, dedicating himself to it as a means of emotional expression and spiritual release. He had found his calling, but not without a deep personal struggle. Van Gogh's early attempts at painting were crude, influenced by the dark, muted tones of the Dutch tradition. But even in these early works, there is a sense of intensity, an emotional depth that foreshadows the brilliant yet tragic artist he would become. His early failures and struggles to fit into conventional roles made him acutely aware of his isolation from others, but painting became his means of processing that loneliness and channeling the intense emotions that often felt too overwhelming to manage. From a psychological perspective, Van Gogh's turn toward painting was not just a career choice, it was a form of self-preservation. It was through art that he could express the depths of his despair, his struggles, and his search for meaning in a world that continually rejected him. His work was both a response to his failures and a way to combat the constant sense of alienation and inadequacy that plagued him. Art, for Van Gogh, was not merely a career, it was an existential necessity. It was his attempt to give shape and form to the chaos in his mind, to take control over the emotional and spiritual pain that he could not otherwise articulate. Yet, this shift to art was not the beginning of an easy journey. His newfound devotion to painting came at a cost. He remained misunderstood by most of his peers and his family. Despite his best efforts to communicate through his work, Van Gogh remained a largely solitary figure. His emotional sensitivity and the intense need for connection would continue to fuel the loneliness and self-doubt that haunted him throughout his life. His struggles to find meaning through art were a reflection of a deeper internal conflict, a battle between his intellectual and emotional worlds, where his genius and his personal anguish were constantly in tension. Through this early period, we begin to see the formation of the psychological landscape that would shape Van Gogh's work for the rest of his life. The isolation he experienced, the lack of recognition, and the emotional turmoil that came with repeated failure fueled his artistic vision but also took a tremendous psychological toll. These early years, filled with disappointment, rejection, and self-doubt, were the foundation for the man who would later pour his soul into his paintings, seeking recognition and validation that, tragically, he would never receive during his lifetime. Vincent van Gogh's transition from a self-doubting, rejected man to a creative force of nature was nothing short of extraordinary. After his initial struggles in finding a purpose through various professions, his devotion to painting began to consume him entirely. With an almost obsessive commitment, he poured himself into his work, producing over 2,000 pieces of art in just over a decade. This remarkable output, especially when considering his relatively short career, was not driven merely by a love of painting. It was a desperate attempt to escape the inner turmoil that defined his mental world. It is during this time that Van Gogh's creativity becomes a double-edged sword. It is both his outlet and his undoing, providing him with moments of transcendence but also deepening his psychological decline. Van Gogh's creative energy during these years is often described as a kind of frenzy, an unstoppable force driving him to constantly create. From his early days of painting still lifes and portraits, he quickly expanded his repertoire, capturing landscapes, rural life, and his own inner world with an intensity that was unparalleled. His paintings were not simply depictions of the world around him, but emotional expressions of the chaos, beauty, and sorrow he felt inside. His choice of subject matter reflects his mental and emotional state. Van Gogh was deeply connected to nature, and much of his work sought to capture its vibrancy, the way the sunlight danced on fields of wheat, or the reflection of the stars in the night sky. His iconic works, such as The Starry Night and Sunflowers, are infused with this emotional intensity. Colors become saturated, lines are bold, and movement pulses through the canvas. For Van Gogh, painting was not just an aesthetic practice, it was a way to process his emotions, to make sense of his inner chaos, and to find meaning in a world that often felt overwhelming. But this constant output came with a price. Van Gogh's manic energy and relentless drive to create were closely tied to his mental health. It is during this period that we begin to see the parallel trajectory of his mental deterioration. As he pushed himself to paint more, faster, and with greater intensity, his mind began to unravel. The creative bursts that produced masterpieces like Irises and The Bedroom were often followed by periods of severe depression and mania. Van Gogh's most famous and disturbing episode during this period was the ear incident in 1888, when he famously cut off a portion of his own ear after a violent argument with fellow artist Paul Gauguin. This shocking act is often viewed as the culmination of Van Gogh's mental deterioration, an indication that the pressures of his genius, combined with the relentless loneliness he endured, had pushed him to the brink. The incident is tragic not just because of the self-harm, but because it symbolizes the profound psychological torment Van Gogh was enduring at the time. The relationship between Van Gogh and Gauguin, who was briefly his housemate in the south of France, was fraught with tension. Van Gogh, desperate for connection and artistic collaboration, looked up to Gauguin, hoping that they could work together to create a new artistic movement. But Gauguin, who was more established and temperamental, found Van Gogh's intensity overwhelming. Their time together was marked by constant conflict, with Van Gogh's emotional instability and obsessive nature pushing Gauguin away. The argument that led to Van Gogh's self-inflicted injury was not just a personal clash, it was the breaking point of Van Gogh's internalized struggles. The loneliness, the fear of rejection, and the inability to communicate his deep pain exploded in an act of self-destruction. Psychologically, the ear incident underscores the devastating effects of Van Gogh's mental illness. It highlights the fragile line between creative brilliance and psychological collapse. His manic energy, which had fueled so many of his paintings, was also the force that drove him towards self-destruction. Van Gogh's sense of self-worth and his artistic identity were intricately tied to his need for validation, and when that validation eluded him, his mind, already fragile from years of depression, anxiety, and possibly psychosis, became a battleground. The ear incident is also important in understanding the relationship between mental health and creativity. Many artists, musicians, and writers have grappled with similar struggles, the intense need to create coupled with overwhelming emotional pain. For Van Gogh, this paradox became a source of torment. The act of creating, the very thing that could offer him relief, also brought him closer to the edge of madness. His work, vibrant and full of emotion, was fueled by a mind that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Despite the madness and turmoil, Van Gogh's art continued to serve as a catharsis, a channel through which he could release his inner demons. His intense focus on color, brushstroke, and form was, in part, a coping mechanism, a way of managing the relentless mental anguish that plagued him. It was through his paintings that Van Gogh made sense of his suffering, giving shape to his thoughts and emotions when words failed him. His use of color was particularly significant in this context. The vibrant yellows, blues, and reds that dominate many of his works are not just artistic choices, they're emotional choices. The colors reflect his mood, his perception of the world around him, and his internal struggles. The intense yellow of his sunflowers, for example, is a reflection of both his love for nature and the urgency with which he worked, creating something beautiful despite the overwhelming darkness he often felt inside. Similarly, the swirling blues and whites of the starry night depict a kind of cosmic turbulence, mirroring the chaos in his own mind. These works, like much of Van Gogh's art, blur the line between the artist's personal pain and the profound beauty he was able to create in spite of it. Yet even as Van Gogh sought solace in his art, the toll on his mental health continued to grow. The very act of painting, while deeply therapeutic, also contributed to his emotional volatility. As Van Gogh's fame grew, albeit posthumously, his increasing desperation for recognition, coupled with his struggle to maintain control over his mental state, left him vulnerable to a sense of alienation. Art became both his salvation and his curse, a way of expressing the deep pain that words could not capture, but also a source of anguish as it often failed to bring him the external validation he so desperately craved. The duality of creation and destruction was a constant theme throughout Van Gogh's life. His artistic genius was both a gift and a burden, providing him with a means of expression but also exacerbating his emotional turmoil. His manic periods of painting, driven by passion and urgency, were followed by moments of deep depression, often compounded by his isolation from society and his inability to form lasting relationships. The more he created, the more he sank into despair. His paintings, which captured the essence of life, nature, and emotion, became both an outlet for his pain and a reminder of the emptiness he felt inside. Vincent van Gogh's story is one of the most poignant examples of the complex relationship between genius and mental illness. His work was a brilliant reflection of his inner world, one that was both beautiful and tragic. The psychological strain that came with his relentless creative drive, the inability to connect with others, and the constant yearning for recognition ultimately contributed to the downward spiral that defined the later years of his life. Yet, even in his darkest moments, Van Gogh's art shone with a vibrancy that continues to captivate the world today. The tragedy of his life, full of both brilliance and suffering, reminds us of the deeply human need for connection, recognition, and the power of creativity to express our most profound emotions. Vincent van Gogh's intense creativity and dedication to his art were paralleled by profound loneliness and isolation that defined much of his life. Despite his extraordinary talent, Van Gogh's relationships were marked by rejection, misunderstandings, and a deep sense of disconnection. His need for companionship and validation was immense, yet, tragically, he remained largely unrecognized in his own time. This sense of emotional abandonment, combined with the lack of recognition for his work, deeply affected his mental health, exacerbating the psychological turmoil that already plagued him. Throughout his life, Van Gogh attempted to form romantic relationships, but his emotional intensity and his inability to communicate his feelings in a balanced way led to rejection and disappointment. One of his most well-known romantic failures was his infatuation with a woman named Curie, whom he proposed to while still struggling with his personal demons. She rejected him, a blow that only deepened his feelings of inadequacy and despair. Another failed romance came with a woman named Sian Hornick, a prostitute with whom he briefly lived in The Hague. Van Gogh's relationship with Sian was tumultuous, marked by both his deep attachment to her and his profound emotional instability. Sian, struggling with her own hardships, was not able to fulfill the emotional needs Van Gogh demanded, and their relationship deteriorated. These failed relationships left Van Gogh isolated, with a deep sense of emotional emptiness and a constant yearning for connection that seemed to elude him. The psychological toll of these failed romantic pursuits was profound. Each rejection reinforced Van Gogh's belief that he was fundamentally unworthy of love and companionship. His idealistic and often obsessive view of relationships created unrealistic expectations, which led to heartbreak. These romantic failures were not just personal disappointments, they were exacerbated by his growing sense of rejection from society and the artistic community. Van Gogh's intense emotional need for validation, which was often unmet, led him to internalize his feelings of failure and inadequacy, further driving him toward isolation. Among the few relationships that offered Vincent any form of support was the one he had with his younger brother, Theo Van Gogh. Theo, who was working as an art dealer in Paris, was the only person who consistently believed in Vincent's talent and provided him with emotional and financial support throughout his career. Their letters, over 600 of which survive today, are a testament to the deep bond they shared. Theo not only supported Vincent financially but also tried to lift his spirits with words of encouragement, urging him to keep painting and to believe in his own abilities. Theo's unwavering belief in Vincent's potential was crucial for his sense of self-worth, especially given the lack of recognition and validation from the broader art community. However, despite Theo's support, Vincent's emotional needs were never fully met. He longed for a deeper, more meaningful connection, one that transcended the limitations of financial and familial support. His relationship with Theo, while loving, was built on a foundation of dependence, with Vincent often relying on his brother not just for financial help but for emotional reassurance. This dynamic reinforced Vincent's feeling of being an outsider, of being emotionally needy and isolated from society. His reliance on Theo, while a source of comfort, also exacerbated his deep-seated fears of abandonment and rejection. The love he received from Theo, though invaluable, was not enough to fully fill the void of connection he so desperately sought. The absence of a supportive community or a broader social network compounded Van Gogh's sense of loneliness. As his mental health deteriorated, his interactions with others became more strained. In some cases, his intensity alienated those around him, further isolating him from the potential for meaningful connections. He was often seen as eccentric, difficult, and overly emotional, which only reinforced his feelings of being misunderstood. This lack of understanding from others was not just a superficial concern, it was a deeply ingrained psychological wound. Van Gogh's intense desire to connect with others was thwarted by his inability to relate to them in a way that was perceived as socially acceptable. While Van Gogh's emotional loneliness was profound, another source of his pain was the near-total lack of recognition for his work during his lifetime. Despite producing hundreds of paintings, only a handful were sold during his career, and he struggled to gain any significant recognition from the art world. The art community, particularly in Paris, was dismissive of his unconventional style. His use of bold, expressive colors, the thickness of his brushstrokes, and his emphasis on emotional intensity rather than precise technique made his work stand out, yet not in the way that would bring him validation. At the time, many of his contemporaries saw Van Gogh as an outsider, a figure who defied the norms of academic art and was therefore unworthy of serious attention. This lack of recognition was one of the greatest sources of Vincent's emotional anguish. His intense desire to be understood and appreciated for his talent was thwarted by the indifference of the art world, which saw his work as too radical, too eccentric. As he continued to pour his soul into his paintings, he found himself increasingly isolated from the very community that he hoped would embrace him. This rejection, both from the public and from his fellow artists, fueled a sense of inadequacy and self-doubt that plagued Van Gogh throughout his life. Even as his work evolved into the vibrant, emotionally powerful masterpieces we now revere, he was unable to experience the recognition he so desperately needed to validate his struggle. The deep sense of isolation that came from this lack of artistic recognition only served to exacerbate his psychological distress. For Van Gogh, art was not simply a profession, it was a means of survival, a way to give his life meaning in the face of overwhelming pain. Yet, as his artistic vision expanded, so did the emotional toll of being unrecognized. His creative drive, once a form of release, became a reminder of his lack of acceptance in the world. Van Gogh's loneliness and lack of validation were not simply personal issues, they were psychological wounds that shaped his entire existence. His need for love and acceptance was intertwined with his identity as an artist. The more his work was ignored, the more his sense of self and his place in the world seemed to unravel. His self-worth, already fragile, was further eroded by the overwhelming absence of recognition and emotional connection. This feeling of being an outcast, the sense that he was creating in a vacuum, devoid of the understanding or appreciation of others, created a psychological environment ripe for further deterioration. Van Gogh's deep emotional needs, his constant yearning for connection, and his inability to find the acceptance he sought drove him further into mental distress. These unmet needs were not just abstract desires, they were crucial to his emotional survival. The rejection he experienced, both personally and professionally, reinforced his feelings of inadequacy and intensified his emotional pain. In psychological terms, Van Gogh's loneliness and lack of validation can be seen as an emotional void that he struggled to fill with his art. But art, while a profound outlet, could not replace the human connection he so desperately needed. It became both his refuge and his prison, his means of expression and his source of torment. Vincent van Gogh's profound loneliness and the agonizing lack of recognition for his genius shaped his psychological state and his artistic output. His failed relationships, complicated family dynamics, and rejection by the art world created a sense of emotional isolation that compounded his mental health struggles. Despite his intense desire for connection, Van Gogh was left largely alone, both in his personal life and in his artistic journey. His work, though powerful and revolutionary, was not enough to shield him from the psychological wounds of isolation, leaving him to fight an internal battle that was ultimately too much to bear. Vincent van Gogh's life was a relentless pursuit of artistic expression, driven by a deep inner turmoil that only intensified as his mental health continued to deteriorate. However, in the final years of his life, he found brief moments of respite in places that allowed him to connect to something greater than himself: nature and his art. Arles, and later the asylum at Saint-Paul-de-Mausole in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, were pivotal locations where Van Gogh sought sanctuary from the relentless pressures of his psyche. In these spaces, his creativity would reach new heights, but so would his psychological struggles. In 1888, Van Gogh moved to Arles, a small town in southern France, with the hope that the vibrant landscape and warm, Mediterranean climate would provide the conditions he needed to heal both physically and mentally. He rented the Yellow House in Arles, a place that he envisioned as a base for a creative commune where he could collaborate with fellow artists. One of the main artists he invited was Paul Gauguin, whose work Van Gogh admired. The dream of working alongside another artist, engaging in creative collaboration, and building a supportive community was a brief but significant turning point for Van Gogh. However, this idealized vision quickly crumbled. Although the two artists shared a deep respect for one another's work, their personalities were strikingly different. Van Gogh's intensity, emotional volatility, and frequent mental breakdowns contrasted sharply with Gauguin's more controlled demeanor. Their relationship quickly soured, and their time together in Arles became fraught with tension. The differences between the two men culminated in a violent confrontation that led to Van Gogh's infamous act of cutting off part of his own ear. This self-destructive moment, an expression of his inner turmoil and desperate need for release, would mark the beginning of a new phase in his struggle. From a psychological perspective, Van Gogh's time in Arles exemplified the fragile balance between his desperate desire for connection and his inability to maintain stable, healthy relationships. His idealism and hopes for camaraderie were crushed, deepening his sense of isolation and exacerbating his mental health problems. The act of cutting off his ear symbolized not just the literal injury to himself but also a deeper psychological wound. It was an expression of his intense inner conflict, a cry for help that the world around him failed to understand. While in Arles, Van Gogh painted some of his most well-known works, such as The Bedroom, The Night Café, and The Red Vineyard. These paintings are filled with vibrant color, bold strokes, and emotion, a reflection of his inner world. Yet, even as his art soared to new creative heights, his psychological stability plummeted. His manic energy would often be followed by deep depressive episodes, and his need for validation remained unfulfilled. Despite his extraordinary output, he continued to struggle with the knowledge that his work was largely unappreciated by the world around him. By the end of 1888, Van Gogh's mental health reached a crisis point. His time in Arles had become unbearable, and after the ear incident, he was hospitalized. He voluntarily admitted himself to the Saint-Paul-de-Mausole asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in 1889, seeking solace in a place that he hoped would provide both physical and mental relief. The asylum was a place of rest, away from the pressures of the outside world, but it was also a place where Van Gogh's internal battles would rage on. The decision to enter the asylum was not a retreat into passivity for Van Gogh. It was an attempt to regain control over his life and his mind. Despite being in a facility designed to offer him care, Van Gogh did not abandon his artistic pursuits. In fact, his time at Saint-Paul-de-Mausole would see him produce some of his most iconic works, including The Starry Night, Irises, and Wheatfield with Crows. The vibrant colors and swirling energy in these paintings reflect the inner turmoil he was experiencing, but they also demonstrate his determination to create beauty despite his overwhelming mental struggles. During his time in the asylum, Van Gogh's life was marked by a cycle of intense creation followed by depressive episodes. The asylum provided him with the space to focus on his work, yet his isolation from the outside world and the emotional distance he maintained from others only deepened his sense of alienation. He would often describe his feelings of loneliness and his inability to connect with others in his letters to his brother Theo, who remained his sole source of emotional support. The contrast between Van Gogh's internal world and the external calm of the asylum is stark. While the space around him offered tranquility, his mind was a chaotic battleground between his creativity and his despair. In many ways, the asylum became both a sanctuary and a prison for Van Gogh. It allowed him the physical space to create and to heal, but it also served as a reminder of his separation from the world. The mental health care he received at the time was rudimentary, and though he was surrounded by doctors and attendants, his psychological suffering was not fully understood. The asylum was both a refuge from the chaos of the outside world and a symbolic representation of his ongoing internal battles. Van Gogh's time in the asylum is perhaps the most poignant part of his story. He sought not only to preserve his sanity but also to preserve his identity as an artist. His struggles with mental illness were exacerbated by his deep desire to prove himself to the world, to be recognized not only as a man with a troubled mind but as a genius whose work had the power to transcend pain. But while Van Gogh sought healing through his art, his mental health continued to deteriorate, and he increasingly became aware of the impossibility of achieving his goals in the face of ongoing rejection. It is important to note that while Van Gogh's time at Saint-Paul-de-Mausole gave him the chance to produce some of his most extraordinary paintings, it also marked a period of deep psychological distress. His artistic output was still a means of self-expression, a way to channel the chaos in his mind, but it was also an indication of his mental fragility. The asylum environment, though peaceful in many ways, could not alleviate the profound sense of inadequacy that plagued him. Even as he painted with incredible intensity and emotional depth, he remained emotionally disconnected, and the desire for recognition still gnawed at him. Psychologically, Van Gogh's experience in the asylum reflects a battle between his need for self-preservation and his overwhelming emotional and mental strain. He tried to preserve his sense of identity, his dignity, and his worth through art, yet each stroke of his brush was, in a sense, a reflection of his internal suffering. Van Gogh's connection to his art was not simply a source of creativity, it was a lifeline that allowed him to feel alive in a world that often seemed indifferent to his existence. Van Gogh's decision to continue painting in the asylum reveals both his resilience and the depth of his struggle. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, he never completely abandoned his artistic vision. His brushstrokes, vibrant with color and energy, were a testament to his unyielding belief in the power of art to express his deepest emotions. Yet, even as his creativity flourished, his mental health continued to deteriorate, and he was unable to escape the profound loneliness and lack of recognition that had haunted him throughout his life. In the end, Van Gogh's time in the asylum was a paradoxical blend of creation and destruction. It was a space where he could find solace in his art, but it was also a place where the ultimate battle for his sanity raged. The irony of this period is profound. The very act of creation, which had the potential to heal him, also deepened his sense of alienation. His art, so full of life and emotion, became the reflection of a mind at war with itself. In the final months of his life, Vincent van Gogh remained caught in the agonizing balance between brilliant creation and psychological collapse. Though his time at the Saint-Paul-de-Mausole asylum had been marked by extraordinary productivity, his mental anguish was far from resolved. In May of 1890, seeking a quieter life and the care of a physician sympathetic to his mental health struggles, Van Gogh moved to Auvers-sur-Oise, a small village near Paris. It was here, under the loose supervision of Dr. Paul Gauchet, that Van Gogh would spend the last 10 weeks of his life, and produce more than 70 paintings. The pace of creation during this period was staggering, even by Van Gogh's standards. Wheatfield with Crows, Portrait of Dr. Gauchet, and Thatched Cottages and Houses all emerged from this time. The paintings are visually arresting, filled with bold, swirling colors and emotional immediacy, but their tone feels increasingly restless, charged with a kind of sorrow and urgency that seems to foreshadow what was to come. Van Gogh's letters during this period provide a glimpse into his state of mind. He continued writing to Theo, expressing moments of cautious optimism, but also profound despair. "I feel," he wrote, "a failure. That's it as far as I'm concerned. I feel like a broken vessel." He knew that, despite his extraordinary effort and talent, recognition remained painfully out of reach. His mental illness had not abated. In fact, in many ways, it had grown heavier, now compounded by exhaustion and a sense of futility. Despite the nurturing presence of Dr. Gauchet, himself an amateur painter and passionate supporter of the arts, Van Gogh's psychological state deteriorated rapidly. He struggled with mood swings, recurring episodes of depression, and ongoing feelings of hopelessness. While Gauchet tried to support him, Van Gogh felt the doctor was sicker than I am, a poignant reflection of how fragile both their mental states were. The isolation that had haunted him for years was now absolute. His art, rich with emotion, color, and vision, remained largely misunderstood and unrecognized. Only one of his paintings had been sold in his lifetime. And while Theo continued to support him, Theo's own life was beginning to unravel. He had just had a child, was increasingly unwell himself, and was facing professional instability. This added a layer of guilt to Van Gogh's psychological burden. The one person who had always believed in him was now struggling too, and Vincent feared he was a source of more burden than joy. On July 27, 1890, Vincent van Gogh walked into a wheat field and, by most accounts, shot himself in the chest. He stumbled back to his lodgings and died 2 days later, with Theo by his side. His final words were devastating in their simplicity: "La tristesse durera toujours." The sadness will last forever. Psychologically, Van Gogh's suicide was not a sudden event. It was the culmination of years of inner torment, exacerbated by loneliness, lack of recognition, and mental illness. His struggles with depression, possible bipolar disorder, and episodes of psychosis had all taken their toll. While his art was his sanctuary, it was no longer enough to keep him grounded in a world that felt increasingly alien and unwelcoming. What is perhaps most tragically ironic is how quickly his genius began to be recognized after his death. Within months, critics began to take note of his unique style, his emotional intensity, and his revolutionary use of color and form. In 1891, a year after his death, several of his works were exhibited publicly and began gaining admiration. Theo, his devoted brother, tragically died just 6 months after Vincent, without seeing the full breadth of the acclaim that was to come. Van Gogh's posthumous rise to fame is one of the most dramatic in art history. Today, he is recognized as one of the greatest artists of all time. His works sell for hundreds of millions of dollars, his letters are studied for their insight and beauty, and museums around the world are dedicated to his legacy. Yet none of this could reach him in life. None of it could touch him when he most needed connection, validation, or hope. The psychological weight of this tragic irony is heavy. Van Gogh's life reminds us that genius is not always recognized in its own time, and that the world can be a painfully slow place to acknowledge visionary minds, especially when they do not conform to the norms or expectations of their era. The loneliness and mental illness that marked his life were not inevitable results of his talent. but they were amplified by a society that didn't understand or support the emotional needs of its most sensitive individuals. Van Gogh's story is not just a cautionary tale. It is also a reflection of the urgent need for empathy, support, and validation, especially for those whose minds work differently. His death, though tragic, does not eclipse the breathtaking beauty and emotional depth of the legacy he left behind. His work lives on not just as art, but as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, the necessity of emotional expression, and the devastating impact of neglecting mental health. In the end, Van Gogh's final act was not one of defeat, but of exhaustion. He had given everything, his soul, his energy, his vision, to a world that, at the time, simply wasn't ready for him. But in the century that followed, the world finally began to see. And in doing so, it gave meaning to a life that had been filled with so much silence, and so much yearning to be heard. Vincent van Gogh's life was a paradox, a tale of an artist whose brilliance was tragically intertwined with mental illness and isolation. His art, which exuded intensity, vibrancy, and an almost unrelenting emotional rawness, serves as both a testament to his genius and a reflection of his inner turmoil. Despite the overwhelming personal suffering that marked his life, his creations have continued to inspire and captivate the world. What does Van Gogh's story teach us about resilience, empathy, and the enduring power of art? How can his life challenge our understanding of the relationship between mental health and creativity? Van Gogh's relentless pursuit of art, even in the darkest times of his life, is an act of incredible resilience. His ability to create, even as he battled his inner demons, underscores the transformative power of artistic expression. Art was not merely a pastime or career for Van Gogh, it was his lifeline. It provided him with a means to process his intense emotional experiences, to give form to the swirling chaos in his mind. His vivid depictions of nature, his exploration of color and light, and his raw portrayal of human emotion allowed him to externalize his suffering in a way that words could not. For Van Gogh, painting was not just an escape from his mental anguish, it was a necessity. Each brushstroke was a cry for validation, an attempt to communicate his inner world, and a way to assert his existence. The very act of creating, whether it was the intensity of the starry night or the quiet vibrancy of irises, was a form of self-preservation. It was the one space where he could make sense of his feelings of dislocation, his loneliness, and his inability to connect with others. From a psychological perspective, Van Gogh's art provided him with a sense of control over his emotions. In a world that seemed increasingly indifferent and unkind, painting allowed him to impose order, structure, and meaning onto his inner chaos. The creative process, in many ways, acted as a cathartic release, an outlet for the pain and frustration that he could not express otherwise. However, the act of creating was not without its psychological costs. As Van Gogh poured his soul into his art, he often found that the more he painted, the more intense his emotional volatility became. This paradoxical relationship between creativity and mental illness, where artistic brilliance emerges from psychological suffering, is not unique to Van Gogh. Throughout history, many artists have found that their most profound works were created during times of personal turmoil. Van Gogh's case, however, serves as an extreme example of the toll that mental illness can take on a person's well-being, even as it simultaneously fuels their artistic expression. Van Gogh's life, characterized by suffering and a profound need for connection, teaches us an invaluable lesson about empathy. His inability to find acceptance and his persistent struggles with mental illness highlight the critical importance of understanding and supporting those who are struggling, whether with mental health or with the isolation that often accompanies brilliance. Van Gogh's intense emotional sensitivity, combined with his struggles to connect with others, created a deep well of empathy in his work. He painted not just what he saw, but what he felt, capturing the essence of human emotion and the beauty of the world through the lens of his personal pain. His portraits, his self-portraits, and his depictions of common life reflect a profound understanding of the human condition, an emotional honesty that cuts through time and resonates with viewers today. What makes Van Gogh's art so universally relatable is the rawness of its emotion. There is no pretense, no desire to impress. He simply painted what he saw and felt, and in doing so, created some of the most profound expressions of human vulnerability and resilience in art history. His ability to connect with others through his work, despite his personal isolation, is a testament to the power of empathy in creative expression. Van Gogh's life also speaks to the importance of human connection and the devastating impact of emotional neglect. His need for validation, his desire for recognition, and his intense loneliness reflect the universal human longing for connection and understanding. The fact that Van Gogh did not live to see his work celebrated is a tragic irony, but it also speaks to the broader issue of how society often overlooks the vulnerable, the misunderstood, and the mentally ill. His story reminds us of the need to extend empathy to those who may seem different or difficult, and to recognize the immense value in their unique perspectives. Despite his struggles, Van Gogh's legacy continues to thrive today. His work, once ignored and rejected, is now considered some of the most iconic and influential in the world. His paintings transcend their original context, offering timeless beauty and emotional depth that resonate with viewers across cultures and generations. Van Gogh's ability to capture the essence of nature, human emotion, and his own inner world has made him a symbol of the enduring power of art to transcend suffering. The enduring impact of Van Gogh's art is not just about its technical mastery, it is about the way it speaks to the human experience. His work captures both the light and dark sides of life, beauty and suffering, joy and despair. The Starry Night, with its swirling night sky, conveys a sense of both wonder and loneliness. The vibrant yellows of sunflowers evoke warmth and life, yet the undercurrent of impermanence and decay is undeniable. Van Gogh's work encapsulates the complexity of human emotion, capturing the contradictions and tensions that define our lives. In this way, Van Gogh's art continues to resonate with those who experience personal hardship, emotional turbulence, or mental illness. His paintings remind us that beauty can emerge from pain, that creativity can be a means of survival, and that even in the depths of suffering, there is a possibility for expression, connection, and transcendence. Van Gogh's ability to create such masterpieces, despite the profound inner struggles he faced, offers a message of hope for those who, like him, may feel misunderstood or marginalized. Ultimately, Vincent van Gogh's story is not just about the tragic life of an unrecognized genius, it is about resilience. It is about the ability to keep creating, even when the world around you fails to understand or appreciate your efforts. It is about finding a sense of purpose through the act of expression, even when the path seems impossible. Van Gogh's life challenges our perceptions of genius, creativity, and mental illness. His story compels us to reconsider the notion that artistic brilliance comes without pain. It teaches us that creative expression can be both a means of coping and a form of healing, even when it arises from the deepest suffering. And it serves as a powerful reminder that the human spirit, even in its most fragile state, can produce extraordinary beauty that transcends time, offering solace, meaning, and connection to those who experience it. As we reflect on Van Gogh's journey, we are reminded that the true power of art lies in its ability to connect us, to express the inexpressible, to give voice to the voiceless, and to create beauty that endures long after the artist's struggles have faded into history. Vincent van Gogh's life and legacy present more than just the tragic tale of a misunderstood genius. His intense internal struggles, marked by profound mental illness, isolation, and emotional distress, are universal experiences that many people face today. While his brilliance as an artist is unquestionable, his life also speaks to something deeper, something that resonates with the human condition. The need for connection, the power of creative expression as a coping mechanism, and the enduring impact of mental health challenges. Van Gogh's story serves as a powerful reminder that every genius, every artist, and every person battling inner turmoil has a story worth understanding, no matter how difficult it may be to tell. One of the most poignant lessons we can draw from Van Gogh's life is the importance of empathy and human connection. Van Gogh's lifelong struggle with loneliness and lack of recognition was compounded by his deep emotional needs. His intense longing for connection, to be understood and seen by others, was the driving force behind his need for validation, both as an artist and as a person. Yet, this need for connection was often met with rejection and misunderstanding, a tragic irony in the life of a man whose emotional sensitivity allowed him to capture the human experience with such profound depth. This speaks to the broader human need for empathy. How often do we overlook or misunderstand people who seem different, whose behaviors or emotions don't fit into societal norms? Van Gogh's life was a tragic reminder that we must extend empathy to those who may seem eccentric, emotionally distant, or even difficult to understand. His struggles with mental illness and his inability to form stable relationships were not personal failures, but rather part of a broader societal failure to recognize the importance of emotional health and support. We can all take a lesson from Van Gogh's life when it comes to offering compassion. Whether we are artists, professionals, or simply people trying to navigate life's struggles, we all need others who understand us, who validate our feelings, and who provide a sense of belonging. Van Gogh's life teaches us that true connection with others is often more valuable than external validation, and that offering a listening ear, a word of support, or a hand to hold can make all the difference in someone's life. Van Gogh's art was both his escape and his salvation. Despite the immense psychological suffering he endured, his art became a vessel for processing his emotions. Through his paintings, he was able to transform his pain into beauty, creating works that continue to touch people across the world. His story emphasizes the therapeutic value of creative expression, how, even in the darkest of times, creative acts can serve as a form of emotional processing, healing, and survival. This universal lesson is especially relevant in today's world, where mental health struggles are increasingly common. For many, creative outlets, whether through painting, writing, music, or other forms of artistic expression, serve as powerful tools for managing stress, anxiety, and emotional distress. Van Gogh's example shows us that art can be more than just a career or hobby. It can be a necessary outlet for emotional survival. His relentless drive to paint, even when the world around him was indifferent or hostile, highlights the importance of finding an outlet for our emotions and struggles, even when it seems like no one is listening. For those who struggle with their mental health, creative expression offers an opportunity to process difficult emotions and build a sense of agency. By transforming our pain into something tangible, whether through a drawing, a poem, or a song, we reclaim a sense of control over our lives. Van Gogh's art, born from the depths of his suffering, shows us the potential for beauty to emerge from hardship. His story encourages us to find our own outlets for expression, to channel our emotions into something constructive and meaningful, and to use creativity as a tool for healing. Van Gogh's life also challenges the romanticized notion of genius, that brilliance exists without cost. We often think of geniuses like Van Gogh as somehow invincible, existing in a separate realm where their exceptional abilities set them apart from the struggles that most people face. But the reality of Van Gogh's life was anything but that. His genius was not free of pain. It was intimately tied to his mental anguish, his isolation, and his relentless desire to be understood. The fragility of genius is a theme that runs through the lives of many brilliant individuals. While creativity and brilliance are often celebrated, they are also marked by profound vulnerability. Van Gogh's genius came at the cost of his mental and emotional well-being, highlighting the duality that often accompanies extraordinary talent. His life serves as a reminder that even the most brilliant minds are not immune to the complexities of the human experience. Genius does not guarantee happiness or peace. Instead, it often demands a toll that can manifest in emotional and psychological challenges. By acknowledging the fragility of genius, we are reminded that even those who achieve greatness deserve compassion and support. It is essential to create environments, whether in our personal lives or in society at large, that nurture mental health, provide emotional support, and allow individuals to express their brilliance without succumbing to the weight of isolation or self-doubt. Van Gogh's legacy is a testament to the power of art to transcend time, place, and suffering. His paintings, filled with color, texture, and raw emotion, continue to captivate and inspire people around the world. The Starry Night, Sunflowers, and his self-portraits are more than just images. They are windows into the depths of the human soul, into a world that is both beautiful and painful. Van Gogh's art provides us with a way to experience his vision of the world, a vision that was shaped by both his genius and his agony. The enduring impact of Van Gogh's art underscores the timelessness of creative expression. Art has the power to connect us to our shared humanity, to give us insight into the struggles and triumphs of others, and to evoke emotions that transcend the boundaries of language. Van Gogh's work continues to inspire because it speaks to something universal: the emotional truths that we all experience, no matter who we are or where we come from. His art continues to resonate with viewers not because of its technical brilliance, but because it reflects the raw, unfiltered emotion of a man who, despite all his pain, still found beauty in the world. Finally, Van Gogh's life teaches us the importance of understanding and supporting those who struggle with mental health challenges. His story highlights the profound isolation and pain that often accompany mental illness, especially when it is met with misunderstanding or rejection from society. We must remember that mental health is just as important as physical health, and that support, empathy, and understanding can make a critical difference in someone's life. In Van Gogh's case, The lack of recognition for his art was compounded by the societal indifference to his mental health. His emotional suffering was seen as an isolated problem, rather than part of the broader issue of mental health care and support. Van Gogh's story encourages us to rethink how we view mental illness and creativity. It reminds us that support systems, understanding, and empathy are essential for helping people navigate their struggles, and that society's recognition of a person's worth should never be based solely on their external achievements, but also on their emotional well-being. Vincent van Gogh's life and work provide us with a poignant reminder of the intersection between mental health and creative expression. His story challenges us to consider how we handle our own emotional struggles, our creative drives, and the way we engage with those around us who may be experiencing similar difficulties. Van Gogh's resilience, despite his battles with mental illness, speaks to the transformative potential of art and expression. Here, we will explore practical strategies that can help us manage mental health challenges, embrace creativity as a healing tool, and better support ourselves and others in times of emotional distress. One of the most powerful lessons from Van Gogh's life is the role of creative expression as a means of emotional processing and healing. For Van Gogh, painting was more than a profession, it was a lifeline, a way to give voice to his inner turmoil and to express the complex emotions that he could not communicate with words. Creative pursuits can offer similar therapeutic benefits to all of us, whether we are artists or not. The process of creating, whether through drawing, writing, music, or other forms, allows us to externalize our feelings and provide an outlet for emotions that might otherwise remain bottled up. For those struggling with mental health issues, art can be a powerful tool for self-expression and emotional release. Creativity allows us to channel our feelings into something tangible and meaningful, giving us a sense of agency and control over our emotions. If you feel overwhelmed or uncertain about your emotional state, consider engaging in a creative practice. Whether it's through sketching, journaling, crafting, or composing, giving yourself the permission to create without judgment or expectation can offer a momentary relief from emotional strain and can help you make sense of your experiences. Van Gogh's intense emotional depth translated into his art, and while this didn't immediately alleviate his suffering, it allowed him to communicate the pain he was experiencing in a way that words could not. The key takeaway is that creative expression, even if it doesn't immediately solve mental health struggles, can be an important part of the healing process, helping individuals externalize, reflect, and sometimes gain insight into their feelings. Van Gogh's relentless search for validation and his inability to find consistent emotional support throughout his life offer a poignant reminder of the importance of self-compassion and seeking help from others. Throughout his struggles, Van Gogh's internal dialogue was often harsh and filled with self-criticism. He viewed himself as a failure, rejected by society and unable to connect meaningfully with others. This emotional self-punishment only compounded his psychological distress. One of the most valuable practices we can take from Van Gogh's life is the importance of self-compassion. Mental illness often thrives in environments of shame and self-blame, where individuals feel they are unworthy of love or help. Van Gogh's story reminds us of the importance of recognizing our inherent worth, regardless of our struggles. Practicing self-compassion means accepting ourselves, imperfections and all, and being kind to ourselves during difficult moments. Just as we would offer support and encouragement to a loved one experiencing pain, we must extend the same kindness to ourselves. Equally important is the need for emotional support. Van Gogh's relationship with his brother Theo was crucial to his well-being, even though it was not enough to save him. The loyalty and care Theo provided offered Vincent a lifeline, but Van Gogh still struggled with deep loneliness, in part because he lacked the broader emotional support network that many others might take for granted. If you are facing mental health challenges, it is important to reach out for help and build a network of people who can offer support and understanding. Whether it's a close friend, a therapist, or a support group, having people who listen, understand, and offer guidance can make all the difference. Don't wait until you're overwhelmed or in crisis. Actively seek support and let others help you carry the weight of your emotional burden. Van Gogh's life, while tragic, teaches us the value of community and the necessity of human connection when navigating emotional distress. Finally, one of the most crucial aspects of navigating mental health struggles is seeking professional help. Van Gogh's life is a reminder that mental illness often requires more than self-help strategies. It requires professional support, whether in the form of therapy, medication, or a combination of both. Van Gogh's time in the asylum, while providing him with some physical safety, did not offer him the mental health care that we might expect today. The lack of effective treatment options in his time likely contributed to his suffering and eventual demise. In our current era, we are fortunate to have access to more advanced mental health care. If you are struggling, there is no shame in seeking therapy, counseling, or medical assistance. Mental health professionals can provide the tools and resources necessary to cope with the emotional weight of life, and they can offer strategies for managing symptoms of conditions like depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. Don't hesitate to reach out for help when needed. Taking this step is an act of strength, not weakness. Vincent van Gogh's story continues to be a subject of fascination for art historians, psychologists, and those interested in the intersection between creativity and mental illness. His tragic life and the brilliance of his art raise a number of important questions, especially concerning how mental health is treated, the complex relationship between art and madness, and the challenges of understanding and diagnosing mental illness in a historical context. While modern readers can easily apply contemporary psychological labels to Van Gogh's struggles, the reality of his condition and its impacts were far more nuanced, shaped by the limitations of medical knowledge at the time, societal rejection, and his own personal battles. In the years since Van Gogh's death, scholars and medical professionals have debated his exact diagnosis. Many believe that Van Gogh suffered from a form of bipolar disorder, which would explain the cyclical nature of his mental health issues, his periods of manic creativity followed by deep depressive episodes. Others have speculated that he may have had epilepsy, due to the nature of some of his symptoms and the fact that he experienced seizures. His ear incident, often cited as a symbol of his deteriorating mental state, has also been the subject of much debate. Some have speculated that it was a result of psychosis brought on by mental illness, while others point to physical factors, such as a possible neurological disorder or the side effects of the medications he may have been taking. However, it is important to acknowledge the limitations of retrospective diagnosis. Van Gogh lived in an era where mental illness was poorly understood, and the treatments available to him were rudimentary at best. The concept of mental health as we understand it today was not fully developed, and people suffering from mental illnesses were often treated as outcasts or subjected to harsh treatments that only worsened their conditions. The stigma surrounding mental health in Van Gogh's time contributed significantly to his isolation and the lack of effective care he received. Today, we would approach his struggles with more empathy and with a broader understanding of the spectrum of mental health disorders. There is a historical tendency to romanticize the link between mental illness and creativity, with Van Gogh often being placed at the heart of this narrative. While his life is undeniably tragic, the idea that madness and genius are inseparable is a harmful oversimplification. It implies that suffering is somehow necessary for creating great art, which can inadvertently undermine the serious nature of mental health challenges. It's important to recognize that mental illness is not a prerequisite for artistic achievement, and while mental health struggles may certainly be reflected in an artist's work, they are not always the cause of their brilliance. The romanticization of mental illness, especially in the context of Van Gogh, can distort the reality of his suffering. By focusing solely on the notion of the mad genius, we risk ignoring the genuine anguish Van Gogh experienced and the lack of support systems that ultimately contributed to his premature death. Instead, we should recognize that his talent and his struggles were not mutually exclusive, and his genius did not negate the need for better understanding, care, and empathy for his mental health. Van Gogh's life presents a stark and painful reminder of the importance of empathy, compassion, and the need for better mental health support. His genius was undeniable, but it came at a high cost. The beauty of his art continues to inspire and touch people worldwide, offering an enduring legacy of resilience and expression. But behind the swirling skies of the starry night and the vibrant sunflowers lies a man who was searching for meaning, struggling with deep emotional pain, and yearning for the recognition and connection that eluded him in life. Van Gogh's story challenges us to rethink our understanding of creativity, mental illness, and the human condition. His life teaches us that while genius can emerge from great pain, we should never romanticize suffering. Instead, we must focus on how to support and nurture those who experience emotional and mental anguish, so that their voices, like Van Gogh's, can be heard and celebrated while they are still alive. As we reflect on Van Gogh's story, let it remind us that true empathy lies in acknowledging the fullness of each individual's humanity. Greatness, creativity, and vulnerability are intertwined in the most profound ways, and it is only by recognizing and supporting each aspect of the human experience that we can foster the next generation of artists, thinkers, and creators, whether they are celebrated in their lifetimes or not. Vincent van Gogh's life was marked by tragic contradictions. A man whose brilliance in art was inseparable from the profound psychological struggles he endured. His creative genius was both his refuge and his torment, and his art, vibrant and full of emotional depth, remains a testament to his resilience and enduring connection to the human experience. However, his life also serves as a reminder of the profound cost of genius when mental health is ignored or misunderstood. His battles with loneliness, rejection, and mental illness were compounded by a society that failed to recognize his worth and provide the emotional and psychological support he desperately needed. Van Gogh's story is a powerful and tragic narrative about the link between mental health and creativity. It forces us to confront the complexities of genius and the suffering that often accompanies it. While the world would come to recognize Van Gogh's art as among the most important of his era, it took his death for his brilliance to be appreciated. His life challenges us to rethink how we view creative brilliance, mental illness, and the need for empathy and support. The legacy of Vincent van Gogh is not just in the paintings he left behind but in the lessons we can learn from his struggles. It teaches us that the journey toward self-expression is often fraught with internal battles, but it also demonstrates that even in the face of profound isolation and suffering, the human spirit can endure, creating beauty that transcends time, space, and personal pain. Vincent van Gogh's life and legacy invite us to reflect on how we can support the creativity and mental well-being of ourselves and others. How can we better recognize the struggles that often accompany creative brilliance, and how can we offer compassion and empathy to those who are silently battling their own inner demons? Share your thoughts below, like this video, and subscribe to Behind the Legend for more explorations of the complex stories behind history's most remarkable figures. Together, let's continue to understand the humanity behind the art. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Vincent van Gogh's life and legacy. If his story moved you, check out our other episodes that explore the lives of history's most compelling figures. Keep exploring, stay compassionate, and remember, the greatest art often comes from the deepest struggles.